Next up, we have, as I pull up her bio, we have Dr. Helena Solo-Gabriele. Dr. Helena Solo-Gabriele is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Miami, located in Coral Gables, Florida. Her area of research expertise is in contaminant transport, and her research focuses on evaluating the relationships between the environment and human health. She was the lead principal investigator on a GOMRI-funded project called BEACHES, which stands for Beach Exposure and Child Health Study, where the goal was to evaluate the possible health risks associated with children who may play at oil-impacted beaches. Now, we've all been pretty busy during this COVID shutdown, but I can tell you that Helena has been working with her daughter, who's been encouraging her to work out more regularly and spend some of that pent-up energy in exercise during the shutdown. So thank you so much, Dr. Solo-Gabriele, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Missy. I'd like to start by thanking Sea Grant for the opportunity to present and for organizing the webinar. I also like to thank the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative for the opportunity to do this research. This research is a joint project between 3 universities. It includes myself, Helena Solo-Gabriele from the University of Miami, North Carolina A&T, and the University of Texas School of Public Health. And I'll be speaking about the impacts of oil spills on water quality, sand quality, and how do we relate that to human health. This study was motivated from the outcomes from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that occurred back in April of 2010. During this oil spill, there was loss of human life for those who worked on the platform. And in addition, there was a massive oil spill that occurred for a period of 87 days that impacted the coastlines of 5 different states. To look at the impacts up close, this is an image from Pensacola Beach during 2010, and you can see the visible impacts from the oil. Under these conditions, it's obvious that the oil is impacting the beach, but what's also very interesting about this image is that you see people on the shore, along the shore near the impacted area, enjoying the beach at the same time. After the oil spill, a lot of it was cleaned up. The surface oil is no longer visible, but we also do recognize that there are layers of actual visible oil that, depending on the erosion of the coastline, may become exposed. And then also, you don't necessarily have to see the impacts of the chemicals. In many cases, the chemicals are there at very low levels that you cannot see it with your with the naked eye. And so there is a need to understand what are the exposures to people to beaches that have been impacted by oil. And so that's where our study comes in, called Beach Exposure and Child Health Study, BEACHES, to look at what are the risks of children playing at impacted beaches. We chose children. First, they're a vulnerable population. They have smaller bodies relative to exposure, and therefore chemicals, the same amount of chemical can make a bigger impact. Also, they undergo various developmental stages that make them more susceptible to chemicals at certain times. In addition to that, we all know, we've watched children play at beaches. They have a very intimate, very intense relationship with the environment. They play in the sand, dig in the sand, in the water, and they're very much, because of the way in which they interact with the environment, that also makes them more vulnerable. So our study had the following goals, which is to look at the concentrations of chemicals at beaches where children may play. So the first step in the process was to look at the chemicals and the concentration of the chemicals. We also needed information on understanding how they play. There have been studies that have documented children play behaviors in residential settings, but up until this point in time, the studies that focused on the beach environment were very limited. And again, we know that in the beach environment, children are encouraged to play in the sand and to dig in the sand, make sand castles, wade in the water. And so the behaviors in this environment are different. And then we put it all together in a risk assessment approach. So again, the vision that was guiding this work is during an oil spill, models are deployed that simulate the spread, the movement of the oil from its source. And our goal was to be able to take some of that information from these models that describe the spread of the oil to then understand what is going on in the zones where people play or the children play, or in the intertidal zone. So how can we extend the information from these models back to the shoreline so that we can then calculate and understand risk? So again, our approach was to compute risk, which is defined as the possibility of negative health outcomes. And I think of risk as a stepping stone process, where at the very beginning we identify the source. What is the source of the contamination? In this case, it's oil coming from the wellhead from the DWH platform. From the source, we then need to look at the spread of that contaminant through fate and transport models. Once we understand the spread of the contaminant, we then can calculate the concentration in the areas of interest, in the exposure areas where people would come in contact with it. From the concentration, then, if we know something about the activities of the people that are exposed, such as how the children play, we can then estimate what the exposure would be. And exposure can occur through dermal contact, through inhalation, can also occur through ingestion, can occur through the ingestion of the sand, or ingestion of the water. So there are various ways in which the children can get exposed. Once they're exposed, then there's a dose, which is what they actually take up in the body. So you may have oil on sand, which is on the child's hand. Only a fraction of that will pass through the skin and impact the bloodstream. So that's what the dose is what actually makes it inside the body. Similarly, for ingestion, you can ingest a contaminant, but not all of it may pass into the bloodstream. Some of it may just go through. So that's what we mean by dose. So from exposure, we calculate dose. And from dose, we then calculate the effect or the response. Now, the response comes from either animal studies or from human epidemiologic studies where people have been accidentally exposed to these chemicals. So, based on what people or animals have been exposed to, we can estimate what the illnesses are associated with it. And all of this is done in a probability manner to calculate the risk. In our study, we all participated on all projects, but we did have leads on specific aspects of the work. The University of Miami was focused on getting to the point of concentration, taking the information about source, understanding, taking information also about fate and transport model to then estimate what the concentrations are along the shoreline. North Carolina A&T was predominantly responsible for looking at the children's activities. They did it through a very innovative videotaping technology. And then University of Texas School of Public Health put it all together, calculated it all together to then come up with numbers of risk. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the source, which is the oil. We all know that oil is a big mixture of thousands of different chemicals. It's like a blob of chemicals. But when it comes to human health impacts, we cannot look at that oil as a whole because every single chemical in that oil has a different health effect. So the first step in understanding the source is really breaking it up, this very complex mixture of thousands of chemicals, and breaking it up into individual oil components. A lot of the models, the oceanographic models that describe the spread of the chemical, of the oil in the ocean, in many instances don't separate into all the individual chemicals. There are a few that do, but the majority do not separate into all the individual chemicals. And amongst these chemicals, the aromatic hydrocarbons are the ones that are of highest concern in terms of human health. They have the higher toxicities in general, and then also they are persistent. They last for a considerable amount of time in the environment. So the aromatic hydrocarbons are these compounds that are circular, and the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the ones that have more than one ring, are the ones that are of particular concern in terms of their persistence in the environment. So we have the polyaromatic hydrocarbons that we want to define one by one so that we know their concentrations in the environment once it occurs. In addition to the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, we also learned through this research that in addition to those, we have what are called alkylated polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or alkylated PAHs. They are the same multiple ring structures, but they have an extra CH3 group on them, an extra methyl group on them. And there's very little toxicological information about these alkylated PAHs. There is some on the PAHs, but there is essentially none on the alkylated PAHs. And we're finding that the alkylated PAHs are also a significant fraction of the aromatic compounds that are found on the shore, along the shoreline. So what tools do we have available during the response? One outstanding tool is the NOAA model called GNOME, General NOAA Operational Modeling Environment, which is deployed immediately, as quickly as possible, right after the oil spill. And GNOME is used to project into the future where the oil is going to go. And GNOME is predominantly used by the Coast Guard to set up for the next day to know where the oil is going to be hitting the shoreline. So there's this forecasting tool that's set up almost immediately after an oil spill that tells an estimate of what the future may bring in the next 24 hours. In addition to that, during DWH, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also conducted a whole series of measurements along in the open ocean and also along the coastline. And that data is also extremely valuable and was happening at the same time as the oil spill was occurring. So to look at this information, I have an example here of what a NOAA trajectory looks like. And this beige color is the projected forecast from GNOME. Projected where the oil is going to hit in the next 24 hours. This information on the trajectories, and this is one of the trajectories from one of the days, was then combined, and this is the work of Larissa Montas, a PhD student that works in the group. She superimposed the trajectories with the measurements that were taken by the US EPA to then separate the measurements into those to where it was forecasted where the oil was to hit. So these data points were forecasted to have been impacted by the oil, for example. And so then she developed these probability plots or frequency distributions of the particular chemicals, of the individual chemicals. So this is one example of fluoranthene, one of the PAHs. And so, for example, this data point as an example may have had this level of PAH, and so that would go and be stacked in this bin. Similarly, the next data point was evaluated, and that had another concentration, which was then stacked in this other bin. And similarly, the next point, again, same concentration or similar in that same bin. It's another point in the same bin. So you can see the stacking effect of the data to come up with these distributions, depending on what the chemical concentrations were found at each of these points, and coupling that with the trajectories. These are the concentration distributions that correspond to the chemicals that are believed, the areas that are believed to have been impacted by oil. And so this information then provides these chemical distributions that can then be used to develop averages and ranges of these chemicals to impact these coastal areas. So here's an example of multiple chemicals that were looked at. Here, Larissa's work, where she looked at 4 different polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and was therefore able to utilize a fate and transport model, coupling that with the measurements from the EPA to come up with these probability distributions of concentration. So in essence, we've gone through this step of the risk assessment. Now, our next step is to come up with exposure, but that will require that we document the activity of the children. To document the activity of the children, one of the steps was to come up with a understanding of the macro activities, and we did this through a survey. Now, macro activities are those activities that are controlled by the parent. So for example, how many times they go to the beach, how much time they spend at the beach, whether or not they eat at the beach. If they eat, do they wash their hands? So all of those kind of questions were asked in the macro activity survey. We collected about 400 surveys from the Miami area and also Galveston, Texas area. In addition to the macro activities, we also documented through Alicia Ferguson of NCA&T, led the documentation of the micro activities, which included teams of researchers that documented by video and note-taking the activities of the children. To give you a better perspective as to how this was conducted is they would sit at a distance and had high resolution cameras and then documented the activities of the children. And in the process, gathered up over 150 hours of footage, video footage from about 120 students. And then they took that information and then converted that into quantitative measures, line by line measures of the activities of those children. So they would take, for example, a 1-hour video of a child, and they would watch it multiple times. The first time they would watch it by looking at the hands of the child and then would document they had a palette, and second by second they would document what was going on with the right hand of the child. They would then take they would look at the video again and document the left hand and the mouth, and what was going on in that situation. Another time they would look at it, we separated the beach into zones, and then they would determine in what zone the child was in. So a lot of information on a second by second basis was gathered for each of these children from these videos. In addition to that, we were very focused on sand. Again, the children have a tendency to play very intensely with the sand. We did document the amount of sand that adheres to their skin under different conditions such as dry, wet, and sunscreen. And we had them we traced their hands, and then we had a hand press study where we documented the pressure of onto the sand, a tray of sand, and then washed off the sand off the children's hands, and then analyzed that for the amounts. And we also did the particle size of the sand that was adhered. In addition to that, after the children played, we also documented the amount of sand that was adhered to the body through a series of pool rinses where the parent would pour water on their child, and then we would then collect those samples and then put them into a plastic bag, decant them, and then take them back to the lab, weigh them, and then also do particle size analysis. And very interestingly, we found that the particle size of the sand plays an important role in the amount that is adhered to the skin. Usually the coarser sand, there's more sand that gets on the child's skin. So we've gone through the exercise of documenting the activities so that we have a better estimate of exposure. So the next step is to take literature values of uptake and then dose response literature values, combine that in a quantitative model using multiple iterations and statistical methods to then come up with estimates of risk. We're still working on these conclusions, but so far, based on the data that we have, and again, we don't have information on all the chemicals because it doesn't exist, but for the chemicals that we do have data on, the acute impacts appear to be, for the levels that were observed after DWH, do not appear to be an issue. And then also in terms of cancer risk, 1 in a million is considered to be the standard for acceptability. And we're finding that for what we know, it's within that frame. It's within that 1 in a million or a few ones in a millions. So essentially what we'd like to see is, this is an image of all the oil trajectories during DWH. What we'd like to see is combining this with available environmental data so that we can then estimate risk more effectively and quickly, and maybe even in forecast mode using the available oil spill trajectory models, available data in terms of measurements, combining all of that almost in real time so that during an outbreak, during an oil spill, we can then identify areas of high impact, medium, and then minimal risk. The reason being is that during the DWH oil spill, the impacts, let's say, to the east coast of Florida and even the west coast of Florida were not really materialized, and yet a lot of people avoided those areas because of the thought that the entire state was impacted by oil, when in fact the risks may have been higher in certain areas than in others. So at this point, I'd like to conclude that we believe that it is possible to extend existing oil spill forecast models to estimate risks. In order to do so, we need to be able to disaggregate the oil. Again, the oil made up of thousands of chemicals. We need to be able to disaggregate that into individual chemicals. And we also need to be able to integrate the behaviors of the child, the activities of the child in those simulations. But in order for these risks to be more reliable, we need to get missing information on the toxicity of oil spill chemicals such as the alkylated polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge our team members from University of Miami, myself, and additional team members. Alicia Ferguson from North Carolina A&T, and Christina Mena from University of Texas School of Public Health, and our teams. My email is here, and I presume we'll have some questions through the chat box. Thank you.